Hello, this is the Dread Weaver. Prepare yourself for an evening of true, terrifying tales that will weave webs of terror in the darkest corners of your mind. If you're a fan of stories of mystery, true crime, paranormal, or anything that crawls in the shadows just beyond our sight, you've found the right place. This week, we have 9 true tales of terror to share with you, thanks to submissions from our wonderful listeners. If you have a story to share, be sure to reach out via the details listed in the description. If you like what you hear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. All of these actions tell YouTube you want to hear more from us. And with that, let us delve into the darkness. Story 1. Never Really Gone. In the 1950s, my great-uncles, my grandmother's brothers, raced stock cars at the local speedway. They were very skilled drivers and always did well in their races. They enjoyed working together on their cars in their time between races, and loved getting Grandma and their other younger siblings involved. Grandma particularly loved spending time with her brother, G, who always looked forward to having her around, even though she was much younger than him. He liked to teach her about cars and how they worked, and often invited her to help him with his work. G was very family-oriented and was over the moon when his first nephew was born. He took great joy in spending time with the baby, playing with him often, and helping look after him to give the parents a break. His favorite game to play with his nephew involved crawling around on the floor, following the baby as he meandered around. The baby loved it and would laugh one of those deep belly laughs, a laugh so big he could barely move. G loved being able to make the baby laugh and was grateful for all the time they were able to spend together. Unfortunately, his time with his family and the nephew he loved so much was short-lived. At the end of the decade, G was involved in an automobile accident while out one night and never made it home. The family was totally devastated to have lost such a wonderful, caring man with such a promising future. But this was not the last G's presence would be felt in our lives. Over 30 years later, I was born not far from where my grandma and her siblings grew up. As a baby, my family lived in an apartment above my grandma's house. One day, I was crawling around on the floor and exhibiting some interesting behavior. I would crawl a distance, start laughing that deep belly laugh babies do when they find something really funny, stop to look behind me briefly, and then take off again as fast as my little arms and legs could carry me. Thinking it was a bit strange and wondering what I was looking at and laughing at, my mom mentioned the story to my grandma. Upon hearing the story, my grandma gasped. She immediately told my mom the story of how G used to play with his nephew, my mom's cousin who was born several years before she was. They were both stunned at the similarities between my behavior and the game G used to play with his beloved nephew. This was such a comfort to my grandmother, to know that the brother she loved and missed so dearly was never really gone. Story 2. The Mall Creep. In my first year of college, I got a job working at my local mall for a well-known girls' accessory shop. It was a store I had always loved growing up, and I was excited to see a new generation of young girls who got to have the same experience walking in and delighting in all things girly. It was so much fun to watch them pick out things that made them feel beautiful and feminine, and to see their faces light up. I really loved that job. About a month into working there, however, things changed. I had worked a number of jobs prior to this, mostly in food service. I had dealt with my fair share of obnoxious and even creepy customers. What I did not realize was that despite having a customer base that was mostly young girls and their families, this did not make me immune to being visited by creeps. In fact, I believe it attracted more creeps, as terrifying as that reality is. Being 18 and naive, I was oblivious to the way of the world, and I learned a valuable lesson here. One day, as I was going about my usual routine of stocking, cleaning, and greeting customers, a man in his late 20s or early 30s came into my store. He was greeted by my coworker and quickly brushed her off. He looked around for a while, and every time I looked up, I would see him staring at me, only to quickly look away when he realized I had noticed. Eventually, I ended up at the front counter ringing up customers' purchases. When I got to the register, this man grabbed a random item off a shelf and made a beeline for the front. When it was his turn, he approached me and immediately complimented my makeup. That in itself wasn't weird, but his demeanor and body language made the whole encounter strange. He was breathing heavily, staring at me with wide eyes that seemed to have nothing behind them. Even after his purchase was complete, he tried to stand around and talk to me as long as possible about nothing in particular. I talked with him for a moment, not wanting to be rude, and eventually excused myself to help another customer. While a little unsettling, he hadn't done anything wrong, and I figured he was just awkward, so I brushed it off as nothing. A few days later, I was working with my manager when I spotted this guy walking outside the store. He locked eyes with me and came right in, approaching me and immediately complimenting my makeup and anything and everything else he could think of. He was no longer interested in looking at the products in the store and seemed to be trying to keep me there to talk to him. I was a little more unsettled this time, but again, he hadn't really done anything wrong. Again, I exited the conversation to help another customer. This time, though, my manager approached me after the man had left and gave me a warning. She said this man had been banned from other stores in the mall for inappropriate behavior with female sales clerks. He would always start out with awkward but innocent conversations and then progress to asking increasingly inappropriate questions. Despite warnings, he continued this behavior until he was banned from stores. After being banned, he would sit outside the stores he had been banned from in the public lounge area, watching the female employees, in particular those that wore open-toed shoes. My manager told me that I was not required to greet or interact with this customer, and that if he behaved inappropriately, she was ready to ban him from the store. Also, it would be wise for me to stick with closed-toed shoes from here on out. Over the next few weeks, I paid more attention to his behavior when I would see him walking around the mall. Every shift I worked, which was several days a week, I would see this man walking around and intently looking into store windows. Every time he would pass my store and see me, he would head toward the entrance. I would immediately make myself busy with another task, and eventually just started going to the stockroom to wait until he was gone. I tried to be sneaky at first, but when he didn't take the hint that I wasn't interested in talking with him, I stopped caring about being polite. One night, I saw him wandering about after all the stores had closed. There was no reason for him to be there, but there he was, walking around and watching employees close up the stores. Luckily, I was working with my manager, and she called security to walk us to our vehicles. From then on, I always had a friend waiting for me outside the store to walk me to my car at the end of the night. I quit only a few months into the job because he made me so nervous, not only to be at work, but wondering if he was going to try anything during a moment I was by myself. Why this man was never banned from the mall itself, I don't know. I moved on from the job at the mall to food service in another town. A year or so later, I returned to work at a couple of different stores there, and while I didn't see him as often as I had before, he was definitely still around. He never tried to approach me again, but I would see him sitting outside my new stores, quietly watching me. It was clear he recognized me and knew exactly who I was. I continued to follow the same safety routines and eventually decided the mall life just wasn't for me. I am so glad I had people looking out for me, and I shudder to think what might have happened had he ever caught me alone. Story 3. The Wind is Coming. When I was a small child, I would often tell my parents things that I could not possibly have known or understood at such a young age. I would tell my parents about relatives I couldn't have known existed, as they'd never been talked about around me. Tell them things that were going to happen before they actually happened, and regularly interacted with imaginary friends. This happened mostly during the toddler stage, and my parents have a lot of stories of strange things I said and did during that time. But this story has always been the strangest and most interesting to me. In my toddler years, we lived close to my grandmother and used to visit her regularly. One beautiful spring day, we were sitting in her living room. The adults were sipping coffee and chatting while I played happily on the floor with toys from Grandma's toy bin. The weather was unseasonably warm, the sun shining and not a cloud in sight. The weatherman's forecast predicted that the next few days were going to be similarly beautiful. I had been playing with a wooden toy truck, scooting it back and forth across the floor and making truck noises when I suddenly stopped and sat completely still. I sat there and stared into space for a good minute, completely in a trance. My mom said it was like I had gone somewhere else momentarily and had an empty look in my eyes. Just as the adults were starting to get concerned, I said, "The wind is coming," and seemingly snapped out of it. I went back to playing like nothing had happened. The adults all looked around at one another, a little weirded out, but glad that I was okay and back to normal. Just moments later, clouds started rolling in, and a huge, gusty wind roared through. Everyone stopped, looked out the window, and then looked at me. I seemed unfazed by the new development and continued playing just as I had been. The windstorm got pretty nasty, and the adults eventually turned on the TV to check in on the weather conditions, as it was concerning how fast the storm rolled in and how windy it had gotten so quickly. Luckily, we did not end up experiencing any severe weather that day, but it was a story that stuck with my parents for a long time. They spent a lot of time trying to rationalize how I might have expected the wind to pick up like that. Had I heard something the adults hadn't? Had I felt a breeze that no one else was paying attention to? Or was it just one of those weird things toddlers say? They never did come to a good conclusion of what might have happened, but it was a very creepy coincidence nonetheless. Story 4. My Patient Freaked Me Out by Outside Pain 4561. I've been debating whether or not to share this, but it's been on my mind for a long time, so here it goes. I apologize in advance for the lengthy post, but I think it needs context. This incident happened about 3 years ago. I work in healthcare as a patient care technician, basically a CNA, but in a hospital instead of a nursing home. During this particular night shift, my responsibility was to sit with a confused patient to keep him safe. He had dementia, so he would try to get up, wander around, or pull out his IVs. My job was to make sure he didn't get up on his own to prevent falls, and to keep him from pulling out any lines. This kind of sitter role is pretty common for confused patients in hospitals. The patient was in his 80s, and he was so confused he didn't even know his own name or where he was. Things were going smoothly. He fell asleep around 11 p.m., but then woke up around 1 a.m. and looked over at me. To get my attention, he said, "Hey, Victoria!" That's not my name, but since he was confused, I didn't think much of it at first. I told him my actual name and asked if he needed anything, but he kept calling me Victoria 3 more times. Here's where it got strange. My parents almost named me Victoria. It came down to that or my real name. They ultimately chose my name because my dad wasn't a fan of Tory spelling. The names aren't even similar. I asked the nurse if this patient had any family members named Victoria or had previously had a nurse by that name, but there was no connection. No family member, spouse, or prior caregiver with that name. Trying to shake off the odd feeling, I told myself it was probably just his confusion. But a short while later, he started singing the theme song to the Beverly Hillbillies, and that's when I really got the chills. When I was little, my parents used to recite that theme song as if it were a bedtime story when my siblings and I asked for a story. The whole situation gave me an eerie feeling, like this man somehow knew things about me, even though we had never met. There's no way he could have known any of my family. This was in my college town, far from where I grew up. I might be overthinking it, but years later, I still think about this night and the unsettling feeling I had. Has anyone experienced anything similar or have any thoughts on this? I'd love to hear any insights. Story 5. I saw him after he died. Not a ghost story. By Alittlebitmorbid. This happened a few years ago, and whenever it's this time of year, I remember it because his birthday is coming up. My mom had an ex, whom I'll call Jay for this story, who she was with for a few years. He was like a stepdad to me. We didn't always get along, me being an angry teenager and him not being the easiest person, but in the time before he passed from a sudden heart attack at age 49, our relationship had gotten better, which made it much worse when he was suddenly gone. He died in 2013. Sometime after that, I can't remember exactly how much time had passed, but it must have been about a year after this, I was grocery shopping. The supermarket was nowhere near where Jay used to work or live. It was a sunny, warm day. I was done with my shopping and had just returned my cart and was making my way across the parking lot back to my car when I saw a car of the same make, model, and color as his. Not too unusual. Then a guy dressed the same way Jay used to dress was walking up to it. I only saw him from behind at that moment. Black jeans, black t-shirt tucked in, leather belt, same haircut and color. Okay, I thought. Not a weird way to dress. Could be any guy, and the haircut and color weren't rare either. He opened the door of his car, turned around like he knew I was watching, smiled and waved at me, then got in. I could not move. I was shocked. I then hastily walked back to my car. Could not be him. It could not be. I had parked my car in reverse, so when I sat down in it, I could see other cars coming and going. I opened my window because I had to gather myself for a moment, and it was hot in the car. Then I saw his car leaving his spot. He had to pass my car, so I got a closer look. He had a few feathers bound together with a leather strip hanging from his rear mirror like Jay always had. His window was down. He wore sunglasses, same shape and color as Jay did. He looked exactly as I remembered him, and he was blasting one of Jay's favorite songs. He again smiled and waved at me, and then drove away, still smiling. I must have sat there for about half an hour. I was at his funeral. He was cremated. I held his urn. We cried and mourned him. My mom also went there, even though they were not a couple anymore. But I had just seen him, in broad daylight. I mean, smiling and waving could have been because I was staring at him, and he was a random guy who felt flattered that a woman half his age was staring at him. But everything, every detail I saw. The car was the same. It was an older car, the color not too common. Clothing and style were the same. The sunglasses, the feathers, the music, his mannerisms, the way he walked, waved, smiled. It felt unreal, like I had witnessed something I should not have seen, like a secret. Also, him turning around when he was by his car, then looking at me like he knew me, like he knew I was there. I have no idea what happened there. Story 6. I didn't need to see that. When I was 15, I started working at a family-owned ice cream shop in my hometown. It was my first job interacting with the public, and to say I learned a lot about people would be an understatement. While I expected to have the occasional angry customer, I got a lot more than I bargained for. My first shift went really well. Not only were the owners and managers good at training us, they trained us not just for the job we were expected to perform, but tried to set us up with training and opportunities that would grow our skills for future jobs. They wanted our job to be enjoyable and to make working there fun. We got free ice cream, discounts for our family members, and they let us bring in our own music as long as it was work appropriate. They were truly an asset to our community and to me personally. Despite all the good things this job would bring, I did receive a warning about a particular subset of customers that weren't pleasant to deal with. As the majority of employees were teenage girls, we sometimes got customers that behaved inappropriately. I know, gross, but it happened more often than you'd expect. Usually it was limited to inappropriate comments, which were uncomfortable, but for the most part pretty mild and something that could be ignored. The customer would be on their way, and that was that. They told me that if anyone ever said anything inappropriate or made me feel uncomfortable, I was not required to help them, and I should report it to a manager. They made a point to say this because of an incident that happened the day prior. The day before I started working there, a seemingly normal man in his 20s came into the store to get ice cream. He got his order and went into the bathroom. Odd and kind of gross, but whatever. Then the man returned to the counter a few minutes later. When greeted by an employee, he began gesturing to his waist level. And when the employee looked to see what he was doing, she realized he had left his pants unzipped with nothing put away, and had returned to give her a sight she would never forget. The employee screamed, and the man ran from the restaurant. Police were contacted and given a description, but he had yet to be found. My boss said it was the first time anything like that had happened in all their years of operation, and they wanted to take precautions to make sure we were all safe. The next day, I worked my second shift. I was shadowing the drive-thru employee, learning how the register worked, how to read the screen, and how to make the dishes. After having done this for a couple of hours, we started to get busy, and a line was forming around the drive-thru. A simple cone was the next order on the menu, and I went to make it quickly to help speed up the line that was forming. As I was making the cone, the drive-thru employee opened the window to collect payment from the customer. That's when she screamed and came running to the back to find a manager. Apparently, the man from a couple of days prior had come back, this time in the drive-thru. He was completely naked in his vehicle, and when she opened the window, he asked, "Do you like what you see?" and quickly drove off. The girl was too shocked to get a good description of the vehicle or a license plate number, and the guy was never caught. Though we had many creepy customers during the time that I worked there, that was the most shocking incident that happened there, and something that I will never forget. Story 7. Until I Woke Up, by VeryEmotionalLaptop. This happened when I was around 12. My family and I had traveled to Malaysia to visit relatives who lived in Sarawak. My family is known for their deep spiritual beliefs and rich traditions. Stories of spirits and supernatural encounters were common in our household, passed down through generations. Almost everyone in my family had a tale of an encounter. be it a whisper in the night or a shadow glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Me, being a skeptic at that age, thought these stories were just ways to scare kids into behaving. One of my uncles ran a small money transfer business, exchanging foreign currency for Malaysian ringgit. His work often took him to nearby neighboring cities like Cebu or Silanggao, and I looked up to him so much that I'd tag along whenever he let me. One night, during a family dinner, my uncle mentioned he needed to meet a business partner in Cebu the following week. He asked if I wanted to come along, and of course, I jumped at the chance. A few days later, we left for Cebu. If you've never been, Cebu is beautiful. Even now, I go back just to soak in the atmosphere whenever my mom and I visit Malaysia. Anyway, most of the trip passed in a blur, as it just consisted of me following my uncle to different venues and eating as much local food as I could. But eventually, it was time to head home. The drive back started out quiet and peaceful. It was late, and after the excitement of the trip, I was drowsy. You know those car rides where you can feel the hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the car pulling you into sleep? That is exactly what happened to me as I began resting my head on the seatbelt as I slowly closed my eyes to a deep slumber. Until I woke up. There was a sound, knocking, sharp, insistent knocks that jolted me awake. I was still in the car, but we were driving along a winding road on a mountainside, the dark trees closing in around us. I glanced at my uncle. His face was tense, and both hands were clenched on the wheel. Normally, he'd have the radio on, humming along to some tune, but now the car was dead silent. I heard the knocks again, this time from the back right window. The sound was too loud and deliberate to be pebbles or branches hitting the glass. I looked back, trying to make sense of it, but before I could fully turn, my uncle's voice cut through the air, cold and stern. Tengok depan, which means look forward. I froze. He sounded different, like he was barely holding back a tremor. He told me to keep my eyes forward, to look down if I had to, but not to turn around. My stomach twisted. Confusion and fear swirled together as the knocks grew louder, moving from one window to the next. Each hit sharper and more insistent, like something was trying to get in. My hands clenched the seat, my body trembling as I felt the urge to turn around, to look, but my uncle's command echoed in my head. Then, as if on cue, the knocking escalated, pounding from every window. The sound became deafening, drowning out even the rev of the engine. My chest tightened, and tears started slipping down my cheeks as the car began speeding up, the engine roaring louder, trying to outrun whatever was out there. Then, silence. In an instant, the knocking stopped. The only sound left was my uncle's shaky breath and the low rumble of the car. I don't remember much of the rest of the drive. My uncle kept talking, forcing a conversation about school or friends, anything to distract us from what had just happened. But I could see it in his eyes. Beneath his calm mask, he was just as shaken as I was. Years later, I came back to visit my hometown with my mom, and one night my uncle finally told me the full story. He explained that the mountain road we'd driven on was known to be haunted. He admitted that while I slept, he had seen something, a flash of black in the rearview mirror, almost like a shadow darting across the back seat. And just before I woke up, he'd heard it too, a whisper from somewhere behind us. Tengok depan. It still gives me chills to this day that the warning never came from him. Story 7. The Scariest Night of My Life by Round Quiet 6938. I've been struggling to understand what happened for years, so I figure this is as good a place as any to share. This happened the summer before my senior year of high school. I would have been 17 still. I'm 23 now, and I still think about it often. Me and my two best friends at the time had decided to get together one Friday night and hang out. We lived in a pretty small town, so there wasn't much to do, and we mostly just stayed indoors. At some point, we all decided to go for a walk down the road. Like I said, small town, so there's barely any traffic, especially when it's late. There had been some logging done a couple weeks prior near my buddy's house where we were staying at, and after a couple minutes of walking, we came to where both sides of the road were cleared out of trees. On the left side of the road, there was this really faint orange glow coming from where the cut-down trees ended, as if there was a fire going somewhere in the forest. The moon was very bright that night. I don't even remember having to use my phone light to see. Still not sure why, but we just decided to go towards it, off the road and into the cut-down trees. We ended up walking for what felt like a good half an hour, not really going too fast as there were a couple of hard-to-traverse spots with tons of fallen trees. Eventually, we got to a point where we couldn't go any further. There was a really steep drop-off for what seemed like the whole length of the tree line, which I later found out was a ravine. If I had to guess, it was probably about 20 feet to the other side, so there was no hope of getting across. On our side of the ravine was nothing but cleared trees, but on the other side, the trees started just a few inches after the ravine and were very dense. I remember feeling really disappointed at seeing the ravine and the forest on the other side just out of reach. I stopped right at the edge and bent down to catch my breath, and one of my friends laid down looking at the stars. My second friend was standing right next to where I was kneeling, staring across the ravine. At this point, it was after midnight. I remember pulling out my phone to check the time and then looking back up. And that's when I saw it. On the other side of the ravine, just 2 or 3 trees deep into the forest, was a pale white figure, standing in between 2 trees. I froze immediately, and I couldn't look away from it. It was very humanoid, and looked to be about my height or taller, about 5'10", almost as if there was a man in a costume standing there. But everything in me told me that it wasn't a man standing there. I was so scared to move or take my eyes off of it. I just knew if I did, it would come across the ravine at us. I worked up the courage to ask if anyone saw that, and out of my peripheral vision, I saw my friend next to me turn his head at me. At that point, I was terrified, because I realized that's what he had been staring across at the whole time, and he had just confirmed I wasn't seeing things. I heard my friend from behind ask, "See what?" And not even a moment after that, before either of us could answer him, there was the loudest whistle I have ever heard. It sounded like someone had gotten right up behind me, bent down next to my ear, and whistled right in it. But it wasn't any sort of whistle I had heard before. It was very deep. I still hear it in my head every now and then. I guess this was what we needed to snap back to reality, though, because as soon as I heard the noise, I turned around as fast as I could and started running, and saw both of my friends had the same exact idea. There was not a word said the whole time. We were all 3 running very frantically back through all of the cut-down trees. I remember being so terrified that if I slowed down for a second, it would be on me. I remember making it back to the road first and stopping to wait for my friends, but not even seconds later, they both came crashing out together, and we all kept booking it to my buddy's house. It was a 30-minute walk, but we made it back in 5 easily. We got to my buddy's driveway and all collapsed. I remember thinking I might have a heart attack because my heart was beating so fast, and we were all scraped and bruised from the trees. After we all calmed down and got cleaned up, I remember staying up for a couple more hours, just huddled around inside doing research and talking about what happened. Me and my friend that was next to me both agree we definitely saw some pale white figure, and all three of us heard the whistle, but my other friend to this day still says he never saw anything. He only heard the whistle. My friend next to me says he remembers feeling the exact same fear that I felt when I described seeing him out of my peripheral vision, confirming what I saw. He said that as soon as I asked if he saw it, he knew it wasn't fake because I was seeing it too. It's been 6 years and it is still so vivid when I think about it. Safe to say, none of us go walking after dark anymore. After all the research we did, we agree it could have been the thing which shall not be named. Yeah, I won't even type that name. That encounter scared me too badly. I get scared now if I even think about it. I don't want to fully place the blame on that, but it's the closest sounding thing in everything I've read. If anyone could shed some light on this, I'd be forever grateful. Story 8. The Boy at the Bottom of the Stairs by OMGRealUFO. And as a side note, if you like UFOs, you can go check out their YouTube channel of the same name. This story is not mine, but my Auntie Linda's, and it's honestly one of the scariest true stories I've ever heard. So my Auntie Linda is a very straight-talking woman. She never believed in ghosts or the paranormal until she experienced something. This encounter was about 20 years ago. My Auntie Linda was working at a care home in Wales. The care home is really old, and it's been a few different buildings in the past. The building is over 100 years old. So my Auntie Linda was doing a night shift, so she started work around 6 p.m. and then would finish the next day around 9 a.m. She was doing her rounds and checking that all of the residents were asleep, and all seemed fine. She went upstairs to the staff room to get ready to go to sleep. She was locking the staff room toilets upstairs before she went to bed. The staff toilets are directly opposite the stairs, so when she locked them, she was turned around facing the stairs. She then noticed what looked like a little boy sitting at the bottom of the stairs. He was wearing old-fashioned clothing, maybe something from the 1920s, and was facing away from her. Startled, she called out to ask if he was okay. Then, all of a sudden, the boy turned to face her. Now, her description still freaks me out to this day. She said when he turned to look at her, it was like his jaw or something was broken because his jaw was hanging from his mouth. He made direct eye contact. Now, you know how kids run up the stairs sometimes using both their hands and feet? This kid started to run like that, up the stairs toward my auntie. She screamed in terror, and as soon as she screamed, the boy disappeared. My auntie then ran out of the building and called her manager to say she's not staying the night. When the manager asked what happened, she said she saw something at the bottom of the stairs and it ran toward her. Her manager then said, "Oh, you've seen Benny." It turns out the little boy was a boy called Benny, who had died from falling down the stairs in the building years ago. Some of the residents at the care home said he visits them and sits on their beds sometimes. Honestly, this story scared the shit out of me as a child, and my auntie to this day swears what she saw really happened. From that point onward, she didn't dismiss the paranormal anymore. Story 9. I Went to Heaven and Came Back by Stunning Heart 492. This experience happened to me about 5 years ago, and it still creeps me out to this day. When I was 14, I moved countries with my mom. This country is known to be very religious, and a lot of unnatural things happened while visiting there. This was my first night in the country, and the first time I had ever been there. When I first got to the country, I felt like I had lived there before. like I knew my whole way around this place, and I knew everyone and everything. When I went to sleep that night, I felt myself getting lifted up. When I got to where I assumed heaven was, all I saw were clouds. I then heard a voice and felt a calming presence which said, "Welcome, my name. I've been waiting for you." Then, the next thing I knew, I was past the clouds and into a neighborhood sort of place. I wasn't able to walk, but I could glide. It was a very weird feeling. I got to see everyone I knew and was going to know. I got to know how people died and when they will die. I saw and spoke to people and celebrities that had passed away, and one of these people wrote on my arm, "Don't worry about what life throws at you, because you'll always be where you need to be. Be kind to yourself and believe in only you." I walked around for a little longer until I got pulled back to the clouds and was told that they had made a mistake and it wasn't my time just yet. I begged them to let me stay, and the response I got was, "Your mom won't forgive me. You need to go back." When I was being lifted back down, I was asked if I wanted to go back into my body or stayed walking around for a bit. I chose to walk around. As soon as they left, my mom got up to go to the bathroom. She walked straight through me like I wasn't even there. When I looked around, I saw myself still lying down in the bed, but I was blue and I looked almost like a transparent sheet. After what felt like a few hours, I laid down again, and as soon as I did, I woke up instantly. When I looked down at my arm, what was written to me in my dream was there on my arm. There were no pens or markers around, nothing I could have used to do it in my sleep. I told my mom about the dream, and she said it happens to people during their first time being in this country, but it was always a conspiracy. Fast forward a couple of years. I'm begging my mom to go back to my home country because this weird feeling came over me, and I knew something was going to happen to my grandma. Then I remembered that in my dream, it was 2 months before she was to pass away, and if my dream was correct, she would start to have complications about a week after I came back to my home country. So my mom finally sent me back, and this was through COVID, so I had to be quarantined for 2 weeks before going home. When I saw my grandma, I knew something was off, because just like in my dream where she told me how she died, the first signs were happening. When I got back home, I told my dad we had to go down to see her. We live in different states. The next day, my uncle called, telling us to come down because she's in hospital and she doesn't look good. On her last day on Earth, I saw 2 people standing behind her, and I had no idea who they were. When my family were going through photos, I pointed to 2 people in the photos, and I said, "That's them. They were the people behind Grandma." I was told they were her parents, and they died when my dad was around my age at the time. Everything that happened leading up to her passing was exactly how she explained it to me in my dream, word for word. And to this day, both she and her husband, who passed away around 13 years ago, come into my dreams to tell me that they miss me and want me to come back up, but it won't happen again for a long time. I'm sorry for the long post, but it's still a very weird and creepy experience to me, and any time I try to talk about it, I always get this weird, empty feeling. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Dreadweaver. I'll be back next week with more terrifying true tales. If you would like to submit a story of your own, head to our subreddit, r/thedreadweaver, or send us an email at thedreadweaver@outlook.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications if you want to hear more. Until our paths cross again in the shadows, stay vigilant and beware the whispers of the night. This is the Dreadweaver, signing off.